Hello, beautiful community. Let's say a few things about Russia's terroristic bombardment of Ukraine over the last 24 hours. And terroristic is it's not a word that's off the cuff. The point of such bombardment is politicization, is to divide Ukrainians between themselves, but also between them and their government. And I think a very important distinction needs to be made here, because terroristic peaks in the war actually bring Ukrainians together and show that there is no basis to a certain kind of wishful thinking that's still there in the Kremlin, that if you stress tested Ukrainians sufficiently, they'll just wake up to the fact that they don't really love the way their country is run, and that they're not so definitely opposed to everything that Putin's project has to offer. There is no basis to that at all. In fact, as far as that question goes, Ukrainians have become irreversibly unified, and here Putin has just not been able to absorb any history since at least 2014. He's dealing with a Ukraine that's not really there. He's dealing with a fictional Ukraine. But while terroristic peaks bring Ukrainians together, the perpetuation of the war without as many terroristic peaks is conducive to politicization in Ukraine. And that's going to be one of the biggest themes of 2024. Ukrainians will be, to some degree, restarting political life as the war goes on. That's an enormously vulnerable and difficult thing to do, but we're going to see that. And there is going to be renegotiation, I won't go on about this, we've talked about this, around the legitimacy of the government, because it may have legitimacy for a short victorious war, but it needs to gather legitimacy for a less obviously victorious long-distance war. And so there is no doubt that the Kremlin is aware that there's going to be more conflict and polarization and more questions being asked in Ukraine. And it wants to feed into this and exploit this maximally. And, of course, the central question is, what is the alternative to a victory in this war whereby we kick the Russians out? If it looks like that is something that we can't do, if it looks like that is something for which we're not going to get sufficient Western help. But the terroristic peaks help bring Ukrainians together. Let me say something about Western perception at a humanitarian level. I think a lot of people in the West are still deeply empathetic with what Ukrainians are going through, and I think events like the last 24 hours dramatize this. But the scale of the response is not the same as it used to be a year ago. Instinctively, I would guess it's at about 30% of the response that there was there a year ago. And this is not trivial stuff, because one of the reasons for the West's support for Ukraine was how outraged Western citizens felt in February 2022 about what Putin was doing. While this decline is inevitable, the West's response to Israel's response to Hamas's barbaric attack on October 7th certainly accelerated it. And many, many citizens in the West who are empathetic toward suffering of Ukrainians are looking at what's happening in Gaza, and they want their governments to stop it. And they see it as almost United States acting by extension. And like absolutely comparing images from Gaza and images in Ukraine. That hasn't helped Ukraine. Whatever your analysis is of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whatever your analysis is of Israel's response, I've said a very great deal about this, and we won't go on about that now. Negotiations. So, there is something that we've been saying for over a year, and I'm sorry that we're going to say it again, but it's really important. Negotiations are, for Putin, part of the continuation of the war and part of getting himself closer to various outcomes he wants to achieve via the war. So Putin wanting negotiations and Putin being not just psychologically but structurally incapable of doing anything other than exploiting the negotiations to perpetuate the war, these are not incompatible things. I'm sorry that I'm emphasizing this when you've heard this said repeatedly, but it's really important. And I think Sam Green did a very good thread about this, and he's been repeating himself about that, as have very, very many people for a very long time. Now, the threads on Twitter. So it is absolutely possible that the Kremlin is trying to put out various signals about how it wants negotiations and that it indeed wants to engage in the process of negotiations. But the bottom line is that Putin doesn't want to stop this war, and he can't stop this war. As I said, I think the last time we talked, even if Putin were given all of Ukraine, he couldn't stop the war because of the way that he is locked in via considerations of regime security and via certain mystical and ideological considerations about resetting the world. How he's locked in to the perpetuation of this war, such that if he decided to stop it tomorrow, he couldn't. When there is talk of negotiations and Ukrainian authorities say we won't negotiate, the word involved there in Ukrainian, same word in Russian, is perhaps closest to the word talks, actually, not negotiations. And indeed, despite what I've just said, there is certainly a risk of that word having been over-fetishized by Ukrainian authorities. That phrase being over-fetishized, that we won't talk to the Russians, we won't negotiate with them. Because, of course, the question is, how is this going to end, if it's going to end? And another question is, well, you can always talk. And in talking, you can say, well, we want Crimea, we want everything back to 1991. That's our talking position. That's our negotiating position. You want to negotiate with that, Mr. Putin? Come along, we're ready to negotiate. One of the things you're going to see in 2024 is, in fact, the Ukrainian government sending out some signals that toy with this idea of talks. That's a very plausible guess. And that the politics there will be to try to take ownership in advance of talks, if talks happen, such that it doesn't look like something so terribly blatantly simply imposed out of weakness on Ukraine. But having said this, the first point remains. There is not just no psychological possibility, there is no political, systematically, functionally, no political possibility of Putin engaging in talks in anything other than an exploitative way, with the end of perpetuating the war and perpetuating the goals for which he started this war. Lots of love talk very soon.